let's talk about mental health and mental illness. This is a topic that I always say is a big deal for us. I think the future of healthcare is really going to be driven in this direction a lot because it's an area in mental of healthcare that's been neglected for a long time, and we have a lot of gaps and haven't really been doing a great job of taking care of mental health. So mental illness just really means the absence of mental health. And it can come in a variety of different forms, so we're just going to talk about a few of them. We're not going to talk about all of the disorders. So this can happen to anyone, okay? Just because you're not mentally ill right now doesn't mean that you would never be at risk for it, or it could never happen to you. Because every human being deals with stress. We're not robots, and we're each different, so we can handle different levels of stress. But everybody has a breaking point where the stress becomes more than what that person can handle, and that's when they become off balance and we start seeing signs of mental illness. So it's really a balancing act between the amount of stress that you are experiencing and your ability to cope with that stress. Not all stress is bad, right? There are some good stresses, like maybe a new marriage or a new job or a new baby. Those are good things generally, but of course they produce an amount of stress on a person's mind. We've all experienced that. Then there are some stresses that are just completely negative, like the death of a loved one, losing a job, maybe losing a house, becoming sick yourself, or maybe your child being diagnosed with a terminal illness. So maybe you can balance, the marriage, the job, but then if your child becomes diagnosed with something, that might be the breaking point for you. So I think everybody probably has a breaking point where the stress becomes more than they can handle. And everybody has coping mechanisms. These are things that you probably don't even think about. They're just your natural go-to when you're stressed out. This is the first thing you want to run to. Some of them are good and some of them are not good. So there are healthy coping mechanisms and there are unhealthy coping mechanisms. If you don't know what your coping mechanisms are, you really need to start doing some self-reflection and think about, what do you do when you are stressed? Because I can tell you, for a lot of you, the plan is to get into nursing school. That is an extremely stressful environment, just because of the amount of pressure and the amount of things that we expect from you, on top of just your regular life, requirements of being a spouse, a mother or a father, working. Now you got this other stress to deal with too, so you need to figure out what your coping mechanisms are. And if you have unhealthy ones, you need to start working on them and finding alternatives that are healthy. So some of the healthy coping mechanisms are on here. Exercise is a great one. Exercise releases endorphins. It's also good and healthy for you in the right amount. Prayer is very effective. It's kind of my go-to, after a stressful day. Just pray it all out. Meditation, being with friends and family that care about you and talking to them about your situation. Sometimes it's hard in healthcare because, of HIPAA, we can't always disclose the stuff that we're going through, but if you need to talk to somebody about something that happened at work, you can always talk to a chaplain at work or a coworker that's going through the same thing. Healthy hobbies like fishing or scrapbooking or journaling, painting. Those are healthy ways to relieve stress. Unhealthy ways to relieve stress would be like alcohol, withdrawing, turning away from people, just keeping to yourself. Those things just really mask the problem. They don't take the problem away. You're not releasing anything, right? You're just masking it. So it just starts to build up and build up and build up. So maybe, when you're drinking, you're not thinking about it, but it didn't go anywhere, so that when you're sober again, now you have another problem to deal with, right? And it just gets worse and worse. So find healthy ways to deal with stress. Probably every person has some healthy and some unhealthy. We just need to start thinking about it more, being more aware of it. So I think we talked about most of these. Nail biting is another negative one, obviously, that can, cause infections. And it's a pretty common one that people have. Overeating, smoking, drinking, withdrawing, just laying in bed all day, not doing anything, not dealing with your problems. It doesn't help the situation. It just leads to more stress. So those are coping mechanisms, and then a person also has defense mechanisms. So defense mechanisms are ways that we kind of defend ourselves when something stressful happens to us. So if we're feeling attacked in any way, and it could be something very small, maybe somebody just said something that rubbed you the wrong way, or you're in an argument. These are some of your go-tos. And you probably learned these just from childhood. You don't even recognize that you're doing them. Most of the time with defense mechanisms, we don't know that we're doing these things. It might be way more obvious to the other people around us than us ourselves. So compensation is making up for something. Like, for example, if I'm very, very lonely, I may overeat to fill that void. Or if I'm sad, I might fill that void with alcohol. So I'm compensating for something. Conversion is when you have a mental stress and it displays itself physically. So, like for me, when I get really, really stressed out, I start getting mouth ulcers. I start getting an upset stomach. I might even get a fever blister. It's just all that stress. It just starts displaying itself in other parts of your body. So people might get constipated. They might have diarrhea. They might even throw up if they're really, really stressed out, or they just start having pain somewhere. Denial is very common, and this is also the first step in the grieving process, is just to refuse to deal with it. It didn't happen, it's not real, not dealing with it. It can be effective for a little bit, but it doesn't deal with the problem at hand, so it's going to start showing itself in other areas of your life. Displacement is putting your anger or your frustration on another source other than the source that it came from. So maybe somebody comes home and yells at their spouse, and then the spouse kicks the dog, right? Rather than talking to the person that you're upset with, you release that anger on another party. And I can tell you, healthcare workers are often the target for that displaced anger and frustration. Maybe that, they don't want to let loose on their loved ones, but they'll let loose on you because you're just an easy target. Projection is blaming somebody for your own problems. This is pretty common with people who have addictions. They may blame somebody else, saying, oh, you've got a drinking problem, when they themselves actually have a drinking problem, or blaming them for breaking something when they're actually the person who broke it. Rationalizing is making excuses for your behavior rather than owning up to it and saying something was wrong. There's always a reason. There was always an excuse. It's always somebody else's fault. And that has to do a lot with blame. You probably know people like that, or maybe you're like that yourself. It's never, ever your fault. It was always something else. There's always an explanation. Regression is moving back to a former state. So this is a really common one that you see with kids. For example, if there's a new baby born and that's stressful for a child to have a new sibling, they may start wetting the bed again or sucking their thumb again. And then repression is just something that's so stressful that your brain actually represses it. So you can't even recall the events that happened. That happens with trauma sometimes. If somebody was raped, for example, they might not be able to recall any of the details of that happening, but it starts to display itself in other areas of their life. Like it could lead to conversion, where they start having physical problems because of all of that stress that they can't deal with. There are other defense mechanisms. Those are the only ones that we talk about in this class. But when you guys get into mental health and nursing, you'll learn some of the other ones. These are just some of the most common ones that we see. Maybe start looking for these things, when you're out with friends and family. People love it when you diagnose them with things. They don't really, but you can just keep it to yourself and be like, oh, there's a perfect example of conversion. Mental illness can happen for a lot of different reasons. We talked about just, environmental stress that happens to everybody throughout life. There's also a genetic component. A lot of mental illnesses, such as like schizophrenia, they have a really strong genetic link. And it could also just be a chemical imbalance inside the brain. You have hormones and chemicals, and if they're off, it's going to start to display itself in different places, and your brain is just another organ, just like your heart or your lungs. There's always been a lot of stigma with mental illness, but I think we're getting better at talking about it now, so people don't feel like it's something that they need to hide. You wouldn't want to hide if you have heart disease and not talk to a healthcare worker about it. So if you're having, trouble with your mind, you should feel the same way. So talking about environmental factors, this is not in your book, but this is something that we're becoming more and more aware of in healthcare, is adverse childhood experiences. So the things that happen to a child affect them for the rest of their life. And there is a test you can take called ACEs. I have a link on D2L for that. It's helpful for everyone to take it just to know where you stand. It might give you some insight on what you're experiencing now as an adult. But adverse childhood experiences lead to mental illness. A lot of times when somebody's suffering with mental illness, we can look back at their childhood and see that things happened to them during their childhood as they were growing up. They can lead to heart disease and early death, an inability to form lasting relationships, and not being able to be close with people. It can cause people to lose jobs, so it can lead to poverty, or they can't hold a job because they just have no stability. And unfortunately, it leads to more adverse childhood experiences. So that person with a high ACE score will then have a child and traumatize that child, and then that child traumatizes that child. So we see that sometimes that genetic link, maybe it's just that pattern of ACEs from one generation to the next. So we want to try to prevent this from happening. So taking care of children is really important. And if you notice any type of abuse, you are obligated. You have a duty to report those things now. You can't be like, I don't want to get involved. You have to get involved. If you're going to be in healthcare, you have to get involved. You have to report abuse, whether it's a child, an adult, anybody who is vulnerable. It must be reported immediately. So now we're going to start getting into some of the disorders that we see. And like I said, we're just going to talk about some of the common ones. You guys get into a lot more when you get into mental health. That's a whole semester's worth of information. So anxiety disorders, these are some of them. Panic disorder is just having panic attacks. These panic attacks can feel almost like you're in cardiac arrest. So you might have sweating, this feeling of impending doom, heart racing, blood pressure high, and it feels very real to that person. Things that are not helpful in that situation is to tell the person just to calm down, or to tell them that everything is okay, because it doesn't change the fact that they're feeling these things, right? Maybe they know that it's not rational, but it doesn't change anything for them. It's something that overcomes them. Obsessive compulsive disorder is sometimes something people make a joke about, but for the person that's experiencing it, it's really not funny. It's an obsession with something to the point where it starts interfering with their everyday life. So it makes it difficult for them to even lead a normal life. So, the obsession could be something like hand washing, could be counting, it could be checking, checking, did I turn off the stove, did I turn off the stove, or having to go through a routine, and that routine brings that person peace. If they can't go through that routine or complete that obsessive cycle, then they feel extremely anxious.